Hey everyone. Right. Sorry for the slight delay in the starting here. I'm only a few minutes late. What happened was OBS, which is what I use to make these streams happen, decided to forget all of the settings because it updated itself as I fired it up today. And because of that, I lost all the settings for the entirety of my stream, so I've had to reset them up from memory. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the let's take that off actually. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the stream quality as reported by OBS and see if I can maybe bring it up, bring it down. I'm not sure. I don't think I'll be able to, but it's worth a try, right? So today's stream is going to be apologies for that. Today's stream is actually going to be two parts. There's going to be one part where I kind of waffle on about appsettings.json and another part where I do some actual live coding. If you want to, if you're watching live and you want to skip the appsettings.json, keep an eye on my Twitter. I'll put out another tweet before I go live again. If you're watching on YouTube and you want to get the second part of this, the live coding, check in the show notes down below. There'll be a link either to the full show notes or to the next video. I'm not sure how I'll do it yet because I'm doing this live. But on that, for those of you who want to watch this stream on demand rather than live, you can head over to the YouTube channel with the extremely useful URL of, well, I'm not even going to copy paste that. That's how I search for myself, you see. I'm not even going to copy paste that URL because it's mental. It's not easy to, it's just a GUID, so that's not easy. Apparently I can change the name of it when I get to so many subscribers, so like and subscribe, then I can change it to a useful name, and then you won't have to remember what the URL is, but you'll have already subscribed. Anyway, so they'll be on here, and if you click through to videos, you can see all sorts of stuff. And you can see like my previous Twitch streams, which are all about 2-3 hours long. That one's nearly 3 hours. So that will be something that happens. You can also head over to the website, which should be appearing around, now let's see, get my orientation right. There. There we go. I'm having to do this backwards, but it should be appearing there, like right where I'm pointing. And that will have all of the show notes, all of everything like that. And to get to those, you would go to Twitch. So you load up the website, go to Twitch videos, and then there will be each of the videos that I've done. Oh, look, there I am. I'm going live. And you'll see all of the videos I've done previously. And when you click through, let's say you go to the Onion Architecture one, it will bring up the show notes. So what I wanted to do, a link to the stream, anything that I link to externally, that kind of thing. So that's definitely worth doing, definitely worth checking that out. So what we're going to talk about this morning, it's the afternoon, it's probably this morning where you are. It is midday here, but I'm in the UK, so it's probably, what, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning in the States, and sometime in the afternoon over in India and Japan and places like that. I don't know. I don't do time. I leave that to the time experts. But, so, what I want to talk about is appsettings.json. So appsettings.json is the way that we load all of our application settings into our application. Let's see if I can just hide this because it's getting a bit distracting. There we go. So we load our app settings into our application using appsettings.json. And if you have a look at, so let's take a look at API. We'll do a dir. So that's me thinking in Windows mode. So if I go into DW check API, that's going to complain and do an ls there. So we can see this program.cs, right? If I cat that program.cs, I'll bring up an actual window later. I'm doing this here so that because I've got Rider already set up, But in fact, let me load VS Code, because that would be quite lightweight and very small. So I'll load that in the background. But what we can see here is we've got this web host create default web builder. Inside of there, and I'll go have a look at that in a moment. Inside of there, well, actually, let's get rid of that. Cancel that. Let's get rid of that. We don't need Visual Studio Code. I should have really thought this through properly earlier on. But if I go through to here, so this is a solution I've got open in Rider. If I go to my program.cs, here we go. Can you see that? By that doesn't look so big. It did look big there. No, let me increase the text size. I'm sure I did this earlier on. I must have reset it. No, it's set to 18. Let's go 22. Yeah, 22. That'll do it. So then what I've got, there we go. That's easier to read, isn't it? Right, okay, so in this configure default builder, so this is ASP.NET Core 2. ASP.NET Core 1 was a little different. I can go into that in a little while. It's the same, except in ASP.NET Core 2 there's this helper method that gets injected to build a web host for us, which is wonderful. But if we take a look in here, so this is why I'm using, oh bother, I've lost my windows. So this is why I'm using Rider, right? If I go to declaration on this, you will see, this is why I love Rider. You can't really easily do this with Visual Studio Code. There's a lot of stuff, right? Okay, but what we want to look at is this line here, line 158. Okay, so we're saying config.add.json file appsettings.json, a bunch of arguments. Then we're calling add.json file again with appsettings, and then we're doing a string replace, and we're getting the environment name, and we're doing true, right? So let's have a quick look at that, because I don't know how this method works, but let's load this. So the idea is that if you have, so what is it, path optional and reload on changes. Okay, that's cool. So now I know what that means. Okay, so the idea is that you will have in here, if I go add JSON file, settings.json. Okay, whoops. Is there one? Oh yes, of course. Not even paying attention. So this is the default appsettings.json file that gets created when you create a new a new ASP.NET Core application. I'll create another one in a moment and show you. But so these are the default things that get added. So we've got a logging section, which tells us that we don't want to include. So this is, yeah. So I'll go through it in a moment. So we don't want to include scopes. We want to do debug stuff, and then in the console we want to do only warning stuff. Now this is brilliant. What about in our different environments? We might want different settings, right? So if you remember with ASP.NET stuff in .NET Framework land, there's a web config. And in the web config, just rotate that around a little bit so you can see a little bit more of me. In the web config, we can have, they're called like overloads. So you can have a webconfig.development, webconfig.uat, that kind of thing. And the same thing applies here, except it's all done for you. So if I thought to myself, well, that's all fine, but I want different settings. Oh, appsettings.development.json. Okay. Does it? Oh, of course it does. I should have really planned this out a little better. But okay, so this is our appsettings.json. Then we've got an appsettingsdevelopment.json, and you could probably see that they're kind of the same. So what happens is, our app loads, we load the default builder, which calls this method here, default builder, which does, let me format these so it's easier to read these two lines. There we go. Yeah, just let me edit the file. There we go. So let's do it builder pattern style. There we go. So what we do is we get the config, we add a JSON file called appsettings.json, and then we add another file called appsettings and then the environment.json. So I have a feeling if I go into here, I think I already did this, but let's do this again. So what happens if the file path is null? think it just ignores it. It'll be that one then. Yeah, builder, file provider. See, this is what's really cool is because all of the there we go. So because all of the source is available either in a decompiler, this one is from Rider, from JetBrains included in Rider. You can browse the source on GitHub if you wanted. Because you can read the source, you've got the ultimate source of truth as to what it actually does. So here we can see when we call add JSON file up here, this actually just calls this add JSON file further down below. All I want to find out is what happens if my path variable doesn't exist. So I'm pointing at a file that, like, if I'm running in development mode and I don't have an appsettings.json for development mode, I'll come into all of that in a moment. We can see here that if the path is null or empty, we throw an argument exception. Otherwise, we add the JSON file, which is pretty cool. So what we can have is we can have app settings and appsettings.development. So let me just close this. So we've got app settings here, which sets up the basic idea of our app settings. And then we have a development one, which will get loaded in when we're running in development mode and will overwrite any values that are in appsettings.json. So if I go here, we can see that we're saying include scopes false. That's the same, include scopes false. And we're saying the log level needs to be default for debug, system for information, and Microsoft for information. Let's have a look. So we've got debug, that's set to warning only. So if you run your app in anything but development mode, you'll only get warnings in the debug log. And we're seeing system.information. If we have a look in here, there is no entry for system. So if we're running in anything other than development mode, we won't get the system information. We'll see all of that in a moment. And we've also got Microsoft information. So there's a Microsoft logger. That's not even included here. So there's a bunch of stuff. So what happens is we load the appsettings.json and then it loads appsetting.development.json and replaces any keys in the runtime version of appsettings.json. What actually happens behind the scenes is the .NET Core loads these things into a C# model, a POCO, if you will, a plain old C# model. So it loads appsettings.json into the POCO, which represents your settings, and then it loads appsettings.development if you're running in development, or appsettings.production if you're running in production, or if you invent an environment name called appsettings.foo, it will load that file, and it will load that into the same POCO, overwriting any values that already exist. So what will happen there is, I've seen this happen, and this has happened to me before, is say I have an app that has a connection string, and the connection string let me try that again, sorry. And the connection string for development is some local DB on my machine, but the connection string for live is on a server somewhere, maybe on Azure or on AWS or somewhere like that. And I forget, and what I've done in the past is I've not included the appsettings.development JSON. So if I can bring up my terminal again. So if I go here and I go cat appsettings.json, you can see here, let me copy paste this into Rider. Imagine this is, oh bother, let me do that. There we go. Right, so let's imagine that I'm working with DW check API, settings.development. Do I not have one? Let's have a look. ls. Appsettings.production. Okay. Appsettings.production. There we go. So I don't have a development file for this because development and the standard that I'm working with are exactly the same. So these are the two files for DW check API. Now let's say I didn't want to have any kind of logging in, so let's rename this to production just so that we're not getting confused. So let me rename this really quickly. You'd have thought I'd have done this earlier, but there you go. Why can't I rename this? Edit. Oh, cool. They've changed it. So this is Rider 2017.3. So that's cool. Production. It updated this morning, so I lost a bunch of settings as it did it. So let's say that this is our local one, and this is the cloud one. So this is what's going to be in the cloud. I don't want any kind of logging, so I might say take those off. And default debug, yep. And maybe I want my database to be production. So what will happen is when my app runs in production mode, it will look for a database called dwdatabase-production.db. This is using SQLite for now because it's a little easier sometimes to understand. And when you run it anywhere else, maybe UAT or staging or QA or dev or anywhere, it will look for dwdatabase.db, as you can see there. I will have all of this lovely debugging. So I can say true, and I could say debug information, and I might want to say I think it's full. So I'll get different stuff depending on which environment I'm running in. And like I was saying before, I've been stung by this before, where I didn't have an appsettings.development, and I wanted my dev stuff to behave differently. I wanted different kind of logging and different databases and all that kind of stuff. And that's where this kind of, it can really help, because I mean, you don't even have to check these files into source control. I mean, it will break when you pull down and build, but you don't even have to check these files into source control if you don't want to. You will need to check appsettings.json, but you don't have to check in appsettings.production. It's completely up to you. The other thing that you could do here is you can use user secrets. So if I go back to, where are we? .NETCore.progman.com, and I do a search in here. Oh, search on here. I should have done this earlier, but if I do a search in here for user secrets, there we go. I can type. So I've done a bunch of articles about user secrets and what they're used for, and that could be useful for local development again, because what happens is instead of storing things in your app settings, you store them in a secret file that's hidden off in your user area. So there'll be, if you create a secret, it creates a dot file, which if you're not used to using Unix or Linux, I'm using Mac OS here, but if you're not used to using Unix or Linux, you'll have seen this in Windows land, but only recently. So you can see here in my screenshot, I've got home j.microsoft. What happens is with Unix-like operating systems, any directories that start with a dot are hidden by default. So you can't find it in Explorer unless you turn on hidden files. And then there's this user secrets folder. And then what you do is you give your app a GUID, and each one of these is a separate app that I've been working on in this instance. And all of the DB connection strings and important app settings, or anything I want to keep secret, that I want to keep literally separate from the code, will be kept here rather than in source control, for instance. And you can see here that literally what it is it's just a JSON file, and I think I've got a version of the contents somewhere down here. Yeah, so it adds like, that's it. It's pretty cool, really. So if you get, so that's what your JSON looks like. That's pretty small actually. Let's see if we can zoom in. Let me zoom in. Zoom. That's better, isn't it? Right, so that's what your JSON looks like once it's on disk. Yeah. And what's cool about this, go back to 100. What's really cool about this is you avoid having to, so one of the things that I did when I was researching user secrets was I did a search on GitHub for remove password. And this search returns quite a lot of commit results. If you can't see that, that's 372,000 539 commits where people have had to remove passwords. And then the same thing for removing API keys, but there's only 2,000 of those. And then the same thing for connection strings. So, you know, it's one of the tools that you can use to not have to do this. And it fits hand in hand with app settings, which is really cool. And that's really all there is to it. There are different, so you can have app settings, appsettings.development, appsettings.production. Let me come back over here. So app settings is your base one. Unless you override the values in a different app settings file, they're always going to be included. So let's do appsettings.development.json. No, I don't want to add it to source control. So you can see I've got appsettings.json, I've got appsettings.development.json, and appsettings.production. Your appsettingsdevelopment.json, you don't even have to have it. It's useful to have, because if you need to make some changes to your app settings in some way, specifically for development, then you could drop them in there. I tend to use the production ones wherever I can, because I'm heading towards like a DevOps pipeline where I want my local development to match production as close as possible, and even down to connection strings. So I know that on production it's using the exact same database name as on local. I'm just going to drop my chair down a little bit. Well, that went too far. One more. There we go. Right. So so even with database connection strings, I have connection strings on local that match the ones on live, and that way I can rule out if there's a problem connecting to the database. I can rule that out. Like I say, it's definitely nothing to do with connection strings and database stuff, because I'm using the same connection string elsewhere. So that can be really useful. There's other tricks that you can do with app settings, so it's well worth taking a look at this page here. I am going to link this in the chat. So this is the official documentation. I'll also have this link in the show notes on the web page and in the YouTube description. So check below. Check somewhere down there for the link. So I've just sent that to the chat for people who might join live later. So you can read through this if you want. What's great about app settings is that you can use INI, JSON, or XML, and it's all baked in for you. It will. .NET Core will do all of this for you. If you have all of your settings provided to you as an XML file, just drop them in, give it the name appsettings.xml. If it's an INI file, maybe you're porting a really old application from C land or C++ land or Visual Basic land, or from the mid-90s or something, then drop it in, sorted. And it uses... Excuse me, I should have taken a sip then before I started talking, but it uses the environment variables. So I can do, so if I want to, let's make sure I'm in the right directory. Yep. So if I want to run my DW check API app, I can go .run, and you'll see it fire up, and you'll see things happening in the terminal here. Let me put that over this window so you can see it a little better. So what's happening here is .NET Core is going to do a restore. It's going to build all of the other libraries for DW check API, and then it's going to build the DW check API, and then it's going to run it. So it'll take a moment. And what will happen is we'll get a little thing in the output telling us what the environment is set to. This is set during this is set in your path. So you can override that value at any time if you want, or you can replace it once during runtime. I tend to not use Visual Studio when I'm doing .NET Core stuff, mainly because I run a Mac laptop and a Linux computer, so I can't use Visual Studio unless I boot into a VM or something. Ignore all those warnings. I'll go into what they are in a moment. I'll maybe do a video on Swagger actually, or OpenAPI as it's been renamed. So we can see here, now that it's started, ignore the yellow errors. I know what they are, and ignore the yellow warnings. There are a lot of warnings, but I know why it's happening. I just need to figure out a better way of stopping it happening. The short version is I have Swagger, and I'm saying to .NET Core, when you build, produce an XML document with all of my XML documentation, my method documentation, and then when the app runs, Swagger reads that file and produces an API document for me, which is really nice. So it's complaining here that I haven't got XML comments for startup.configure services. That's not something that Swagger can see or talk to, so there's absolutely no point in me adding those documentation. So I may just add empty documentation for now. I don't know. But anyway, back to the point. So we've run there's a point, yes. So we've run the application. We can see here hosting environment. There was an older video I did just before Christmas where I spent ages trying to get this bit right, and I wanted to keep it in. I didn't edit it. It's one of the videos. Sung will know which one I mean if he watches this on demand. He'll know which one I mean because he was trying to help me out whilst I was doing it. So you can see here the hosting environment is set to production, right? That means that it's using my appsettings.production file for things like connection strings and log leveling. I can cancel this, and if I go ASP.NET Core _environment and set that to development.NET run, what will happen here is the ASP.NET Core environment, this hosting environment variable, will be temporarily set to development, and that temporarily means until the next command is completed. So the .NET run will not complete until I cancel out when I cause the application to shut down by doing Control-C. So if I do that, it's not exactly how it works, but this is basically how Visual Studio boots your app in debug mode or production mode when you're in Visual Studio and you hit run, and there's a little toggle at the top for debug and release. If you set it to debug and you run it, then it will boot the app in debug mode by running it in development and doing some really cool stuff under the covers, doing some like optimization and that. It's really cool. I'm just going to turn this up so I can hear myself a little better. But the headphones are plugged into the microphone so I can hear myself better. It's something that I've started to try out recently. Just while that starts, I've started, oh look, it's needed to build my database. That's something to do specifically with the code. When the code runs in development mode, it does extra stuff. It checks whether the database exists and tries to seed data if the database doesn't exist. So these are entity framework commands that are being outputted to the terminal as an info message to let me know, hey, EF core is doing something. But you'll also see, so going back to the previous point while I finish that off, so one of the things I've started doing when I'm recording podcast episodes, it's not a development podcast, it's for the waffling tailors. Okay, I just kicked something and he went buff. So, or we got some mail, I don't know. Anyway, so one of the things I've started to do when I'm recording the podcast with my brother and my friends, which is a video game podcast for the waffling tailors, is that we do, I plug headphones in and I listen whilst everyone's talking and sort of tweak the audio, do a little bit of audio engineering stuff, although I'm not an audio engineer. And I picked that up from the ASP.NET Core stand-ups. So these are amazing. So almost every week since .NET Core was announced as open source, the ASP.NET team have met and done a live conference call where they talk to the community. They get people in who are engineers. They've got Ryan from the ASP.NET Core team. They had a chat with Sebastian Ross. They talked about Signal R. In this episode, they officially announced that Blazor, and if you haven't looked it up, Blazor is amazing. Blazor is now an official ASP.NET thing. It's part of the GitHub repository for ASP.NET Core now, so that's amazing. Blazor, in short, is you can use C# in the browser. I'll just let that sink in for a second. Good. Okay. So yeah, these videos are amazing. It's well worth watching them. They're usually about 45 minutes to an hour and a half long, but they only do one a week. As you can see, January 31st, February 6th, February 14th. And they're run by Scott Hanselman, John Galloway, and Damien Edwards. And they really know their stuff. So it's definitely worth checking these guys out. It used to be hosted on Scott Hanselman's private YouTube account, but now they've moved to the .NET Foundation's YouTube account. Another quick tip as well, .NET Foundation. Not a lot of people know about this, but the .NET Foundation are a cool bunch of people. It's definitely worth checking these guys out. So these are the folks who sort of steer the .NET ecosystem, and they're sort of, I mean, I'm going to get it wrong. Go read through their stuff in their about page. They help set up meetups and stuff like that, and they're all about furthering the cause of .NET Core, ASP, .NET Core, .NET Framework, .NET Standard, all that kind of stuff. So it is partially run by people from Microsoft, but part of their day job is to work for the foundation. And it's, so if I scroll down, there are specific, if you have a project, you can have that project adopted by the foundation, which means they'll help you out with like hosting costs and development costs and stuff like that. I don't want to speak for them because I'm not a member of the foundation, so that information might be wrong. It may have changed. It is well worth checking it out. So I'll close that. So you definitely watch these. These are brilliant. This is where I get a lot of my up and coming up to the moment information, because I'm not MVP yet. So I don't get the insider Microsoft information. So this is where I got all of my .NET Core information from. The sort of the new information. So that's cool. But yes, so I'll put those in the show notes as well. So let me just get those links again so I can share them with anyone who joins in. So these are going in the chat. So the live.asp.net is in the chat. And if I go .NET Foundation, .NET Foundation, there we go. Here we go. So it's definitely worth checking these out. I'm putting these in the chat because then I can pull the links back later from the chat. But yes, it's definitely worth looking into app settings, and that's basically all there is to it. There's nothing much more than that. It's worth reading through the documentation because it goes into a lot of how everything works in the behind the scenes and stuff, and it links to the source code, and you can find out things like how to load a non-appsettings.json file into a POCO and pass that round in your application. Pro tip, if you go check out the OWASP headers core repo, again, I'll put the show notes. If you check out this repo either before I make the changes in a little while, or rewind go through the commits, you'll see how this works. So you'll see that, in fact, let's just do it now. Let's do it now. I have Rider open. So let's go into OWASP header settings doodah, and you'll see, let's close this. Oh, bother, let's just close all of these. This is easier. Right, so there we go. So you'll see here that I can load a, is that from there? Yeah, so let's just make sure I've got my files right. Yep. So in my configure services method, I can call a method that says services.configure this POCO and load it from this file. So what happens at startup is .NET Core loads all JSON files it can find in the root of your project. So you'll see there's app settings production, app settings development, that one's showing in red because I haven't added it to source control. And there's also secure headers JSON, right? That's loaded in as a POCO into the configuration object, which you can see here. Configuration is a type of I configuration. So if I go to declaration, it is an interface with a set of key value pairs. Yeah. And that's all it really is. It's just an interface of key value pairs. There's a little bit more to it than that, but it's an interface of key value pairs, and you can say configuration.getSection, and give it the name of a section, and that name of the section comes from this section here. So within this JSON file, I've got an object in the JSON file called secure headers middleware configuration. Within that, I've got the configuration for my secure headers middleware, and that all gets loaded in at runtime. Yes, it gets loaded in at runtime because I'm saying add this JSON file. I'm saying reload the entire application when it changes, and that it is optional. It doesn't need to be there. So if it's not there, don't throw the error, just continue working. So in the startup.cs, I could say configuration, which remember there's a big global, excuse me, it's an accessible, it's a large POCO that is used, which can represent all of your JSON, XML, and INI files that you load in at runtime when you're building your web host in here. So it's stored in your web host, which is what startup.cs is meant to represent, right? And you say, get me this section labeled secure headers middleware configuration, which will look like a C# version of this. So there will be a bool called use HSTS. There'll be an object called HSTS configuration, which has a value of max age, which is an int. Include subdomains, which is a bool, and it will, and there's a char there, which it comes out as a string. You don't have to tell .NET Core what your types are. You can. You can make a JSON schema and you can apply that to it, and then if you put a value in that's not right, then .NET Core will raise an exception when it starts and says, hey, it doesn't match the schema, what are you doing? But yes, so I could do that. So I say services.configure that value, and then in here, I can say, I could pass into my configuration method an iOptions of type secure header middleware configuration. This is another interface, right? And it uses the secure header configuration, which is my if I go to, this is a POCO I've designed, which matches the JSON, and it has all of these things, right? This is then passed in via dependency injection. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word then. Passed in via dependency injection into the configure method, and then and given the name secure header settings, we then pass that the thing's value. So this here is an iOptions of type, right? So if I go to declaration, in here we have the value inside of it. So we need to unwrap that by just accessing that property, that method. Yeah, that member, sorry, the property, yeah. And then this is then currently passed into a method here. So what happens at runtime is we say in the program.cs, when we're building the web host, also grab this file, so you can see that it's entirely extensible. You can say, grab this file, grab that file. So we're saying here, grab me this JSON file, put it into my web host, and then in startup.cs, where we're configuring the services, we're saying hydrate me an object from that file and give me it so I can use it in the services. And then we're saying dependency injector into the configure method. Once it's in there, I want to be able to use it here. So what I've done here, and there's a big write-up about this on the blog. Oh, I've just had a question in the chat. I didn't even spot it. That I feel like I need to have that somewhere on the screen, but that's cool. So user XCXOOXI. I have no idea how to pronounce that, so I'm sorry. I'll just read it out letter for letter. Hello. This particular user has asked, what am I building? I'm not building anything yet. I'm just going through .NET Core's appsettings.json and how that's all loaded. So I don't mind, I'll rewind a little bit and go through what I've just said. It's not a problem. I don't mind doing that. So I was saying that if I just go back, so oh, XCX. Okay, that's cool. Hey, XCX. Let's move that mouse pointer, otherwise it's taking up the screen. So for the benefit of XCX, if I go back over here, we're looking at my project here, owasp-headers.core, which is a ASP.NET Core middleware. That's a lot that I'm saying here. It's an ASP.NET Core middleware, which deals with HTTP requests as they come into the application. And what it does is it will add specific headers to... okay. So XEX has said that they're familiar with .NET Core enough, so that's cool. But I'll still continue with my little description there. So what it does is it injects headers into the request before it's built up and sent out, and these are based on the OWASP headers guidelines. So that's pretty cool. In the second part to this stream, once I'm finished talking about app settings, I'm going to stop for a little bit and then start up again. The second part of the stream is going to be me working on this and working on a specific issue. This issue here. So the issue that I've got is that it uses a JSON file, and I want it to be a Fluent API for setting things up. So that's the next part of this. So I'll just go back a few. There we go. So for the benefit of XEX, what I was saying was, .NET Core has this wonderful thing where you can load in JSON files in your web host. So I'm loading in a secure headers.json file, secure header settings.json file, and that's loaded in from here. This represents a POCO that I'm hydrating. And what happens is this config file is added into my web host, my iWeb host, before I tell it to run. When I tell it to run, it calls the startup.cs. Excuse me, and in just startup.cs, I'm saying configure me a POCO of type secure headers middleware configuration from the configuration section named secure headers middleware, and I've got that from within here, within my JSON. My object is called secure header middleware configuration. So that's how .NET Core knows to go and get that bit for me. That could be a JSON file, it could be an INI file, it could be an XML file, it could be one of those three. It really doesn't matter. So that sets it up and adds it into the services collection. And then in the configuration method, we dependency inject it in as an iOptions, and then we can use that wherever we want. I'm using that as part of my middleware, but we could maybe output it to the screen, or download it to the user, or send it through as part of a response. It really doesn't matter. Excuse me, I have a very dry throat today. And what I was getting at before then was that you can have multiple levels of app settings. So I have an appsettings.json here. There we go. An appsettings.json here, which represents a database I'm connecting to and the log levels, and a calls policy. These things I'm using in another app. This is a appsettings.json file from a different app. And I have an empty appsettings development.json, which means that in development mode, I'll be using these values. Because what .NET Core does is it comes along, grabs your appsettings.json, hydrates that to a POCO, and then it goes, which environment am I in? Oh, I'm in development. Brilliant. I'll go get appsettings.development.json if it exists. If it does, I'll then hydrate that. So hydrate is take a deserialize, take a serialized object and put it back into an object ready to be used by the code. And then it goes, brilliant, overwrite any values in the hydrated appsettings.json object with any values from appsettings.development. It places that one in there. Or if I run in production, it does the same thing, appsettings.json, hydrate to a POCO, appsettings.production, hydrate to a POCO, and overwrite the values in the original one. It's a little more complex than that, and it's a lot more optimized than that, but that's basically the crux of what it does. And you could do this with XML, INI, JSON, loads of stuff. I've got some links in the chat. I don't know whether you can see those, but if you scroll up through those, there's some links there for documentation. It's definitely worth taking a look through this, the fundamentals configuration file. The documentation file is really in depth, and it talks about how to load those things in from different places, and that kind of thing, and how you can create entity framework stuff, which is really cool. I don't use it, but it's really cool. But that's basically it. So yeah, app settings is really cool. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it. I don't think I have actually. I also talked earlier on as well about Did I take a link to it? No, I didn't. So I talked earlier on about user secrets. So user secrets are really cool. If you don't want to store something in your app settings, you can store it in user secrets. These are then stored in a hidden, for a given value of hidden file on your machine, and they're stored completely separate to. I'll just put this into the chat as well, so I know to put a link to that in my show notes later. So these are used in place of having to do things like this with GitHub. So if you're hosting something publicly, there are 372,513 commits where people are removing passwords from their code, which is just it's astounding, really. I mean, it's easily done, but it's quite astounding. But yes, so that's one of the things. So user secrets is really for local development, and it can be really useful for that, for not having to commit your app settings into, or your secrets, sorry, into source control. You can extend that if you're hosting with Azure, and there's an Azure secrets idea, but you know, that's pretty useful, but out of scope for this video. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop it there, mainly because I've got a really dry, scratchy throat, and I will come back in half an hour or so, and I'll do some live coding where I'm going to work on, like I say, I'm going to work on this issue that I've spotted with my OWASP headers core repo, and I'm going to attempt to make it a builder pattern, and I'm going to talk about builder pattern rather than using the JSON file, which the problem here, just so that you all know what's going on. So the problem here is that it would depend entirely on how someone is implementing and using the OWASP headers core. You don't have to have a JSON file. If there is one present, then it will use those values. If there isn't one present, then it will use default values that I've just sort of set up, which is useful. But if you don't know that the JSON file exists, then you're not going to use the right values. And what happens if somebody sets that? So if you can't read that, that says reload on change true. So your application is running on a Windows server or a Linux server. It's running in the wild. Someone comes along and changes the contents of this file ever so slightly. He goes, oh, right, yeah, that should be that. What happens then, because of reload on change, is your entire app stops. It starts back up again, which is no good, especially in production. So what I'm going to do is I'm moving away from JSON files and make it, because this is something that you want to change once and then have to rebuild your app for. So it's a compile time issue now rather than a runtime issue, or it will be a compile time issue rather than a runtime issue. And the idea will be that you come in here, you do some, so it will be something like, where are we? It will be use secure headers middleware, and then it'll be a, where are we? Oh, bother. Let me get rid of this. It'll do some of that, and then it'll be use HSTS, whoops, STS, and then it'll be use HKPK, and there'll be a little, oh goodness, PK, there'll be a little warning when you use that one saying you shouldn't really use this because it's being deprecated in Chrome and Firefox. And then there'll be a little, I'll add little things like there'll be a default one, and you know, and then there'll be a .build, which will actually return the value. But what I'll need to do is I'll need to figure out how I'm going to do this, make some changes. I've done this with test-driven development. So when I start making changes to my code, it's going to break the tests. So you can see here, I mean, they're not very complex tests, but my tests for this, so because it's a piece of middleware, I'm having to jump into the pipeline and I'm saying, whoops, I'm saying when we invoke this particular, when we invoke it, is this header present? Whoops, I've just got to paste it that somehow. So we're saying, is this header present? And then that means we need to dig into the actual response that we're generating and check whether things are equal to stuff. So yeah, it's going to break. I'm going to have to rethink how I do the tests, I think, because so the tests currently use just hard-coded values. You can see there, does it have this, and is that working, you know, that, but that isn't going to work now because it's all compile time. So I'm going to have to think about how I do the tests. I may have to disable the test for now, get it working, and then think of how I'm going to redo the tests. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to do in, I would say, about half an hour. I'll come back. I'll actually shut off the stream because it's pointless just leaving it streaming nothing. I'll shut off the stream. I'll do this, then I'll come back, and then I'll have a look at what I need to do this. And what I'll do this live. I haven't even thought about this. The only thought I've had about this is what you can see in the issue. So that's as far as my thought process has gone. So if you want to watch along, please watch along and read through this description first. You've got half an hour from about 10 minutes from now. So if you can, take a look through, and then I'll come back and I'll hit it the same sort of ideas as maybe you have, and then I'll same thing for the YouTube. I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about fluid interfaces and builder patterns and stuff, and then I'll just get on with it. So that'll be in about half an hour, I think. So join me again in half an hour, I guess. Once I've had some lunch and I've had lots to drink to sort my throat out because it's really scratchy and horrible so far, and we'll see what we can do. We'll come back to this and we'll run through it. So in that case, I will see you in about half an hour. If you're going to join me live. If you're not going to join me live, I'll see you in the next video, I guess. Cool. All right.